Okay. So welcome everyone. My name is Jess Sappington and I am the Food Systems Program Coordinator at WSU Kitsap Extension. Tonight is our latest Dirt Talk Farmer to Farmer event, and it's the final discussion of our special three-part integrated pest management series for 2021. We're going to be focusing tonight all on Clubroot. So for those who have not attended a previous Dirt Talk, events are hosted in coordination with regional small farms, with local farmers and agricultural specialists that are willing to share out their expertise on a given topic. So tonight we're excited to have Laurel Moulton, who's with us, and she's a regional IPM specialist for the Clallam, Jefferson, and Kitsap counties, as well as local farmer Betsey Wittick of Bainbridge Vineyards and Laughing Crow Farm. So the discussion is going to be presentation style. If you have any questions that you don't want to forget to ask, please make sure to utilize the chat box during the talk. And we'll do our best to circle back to those. And we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion from the group. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Laurel and Betsey, and they can give a little bit of info and background about themselves before we dive right into the discussion. Laurel, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Laurel Moulton. I work for WSU Clallam County Extension, and I'm an integrated pest management specialist with the Regional Small Farms program. Betsey.
Okay, let's see. All right, I just like talk. I don't know if my picture shows or not, but I'm Betsey Wittick, and I'm a farmer here on Bainbridge Island. I've been farming for a little over 30 years. I grow mixed vegetables as part of Laughing Crow Farm, and also grow grapes, make wine over here at Bainbridge Vineyards. And I work a lot with farm interns, and a lot of my former interns are farming in Kitsap County, and I think parts of Jefferson County as well. So that's that.
Great. Thanks, Betsey. So how this is going to work is I'm just going to talk about a little bit about Clubroot and management tactics, and Betsey's going to join me in the conversation about what things she's done, and then we'll open it up for conversation. So and hopefully answer all your questions as well. So first I'll introduce the disease that we're talking about. This is Clubroot. You've got some examples here of Clubroot on broccoli, the top picture. And that was actually infected before it was even planted in the pot. And the one below is bok choy. So infected plants are oftentimes people first notice them in the field because their broccoli, let's say, is just, you just irrigated, it's the middle of the day and it's wilted. But in the morning it's kind of perked up and then it wilts in the middle of the day again. And it keeps doing that, when it's perfectly well watered. The plants may also be stunted and yellow. They also may not show any above ground symptoms because there's different varieties of Brassicas that are more or less susceptible to the disease. If you dig up the plant, you'll find thickened roots. Sometimes they're clubbed, sometimes they're just really thick. They just don't look right. And if you get a plant early enough, for example, if you purchase some starts from a different farm, they may not show symptoms if they're infected for 3 to 5 weeks after the infection has occurred. So the organism Clubroot is not quite a fungus, it's a fungus-like organism. There's multiple different races of this organism. And so it affects the resistance of different varieties of plants. In addition to almost everything in the Brassica family, this can also, there's evidence that it infects plants in the rose family, like strawberries, poppies, knotweed, like curly dock, legumes like I think purple clover is that one, and then several grasses in the grass family like orchard grass and certain creeping fescues. maybe not fescue. Anyway, some pretty common grasses around here. Those ones, when they get infected, they don't show the typical clubbing that the Brassica family plants do. The organism prefers wet soil. You'll see over to the right, this is a diagram of the life cycle. So it starts off with these resting spores. These are really tough spores that hang out in the soil. And when they sense the exudates from the roots of a Brassica plant, that causes them to germinate essentially. They form these zoospores, and those zoospores will then swim to the host plant. So that's why they like the wet environment. They prefer acidic soil, and they spread through any way that soil can spread. So in this life cycle, I mentioned you've got the resting spores, the zoospores. They'll infect the fine roots, and they create a secondary body that will produce more of the zoospores, which go on to infect larger roots on the plant and also neighboring plants. So this secondary infection is when the thickened roots start to show up. And this happens because the changes in hormones in the plant cause the cells to multiply and be bigger than usual. Once you get these clubs, they will eventually rot, and it can happen even when the plant is still alive. And when they rot, late in the life cycle, they create resting spores, literally millions of them. And so as these clubbed roots in the ground start rotting, that's where these are released more. I just wanted to point out 2 places in the life cycle that are vulnerable to management tactics. The first one is these zoospores. Sometimes the resting spores will germinate, and then something in this stage will prevent them from actually infecting the plants. The second one is keeping those spores out of your fields. So we'll talk about how you do that in some of the management tactics. So first, in your integrated pest management plan for this, the first part is identifying your problem. So you should be able to do that now. The second one is monitoring. So you just want to make sure that everybody who works on your farm knows what to look for. You want to, if you're importing starts from off the farm, you want to poke around and check all the roots of those. Even if you have, just a couple infected plants among hundreds or thousands, that can start, the problems for your farm. If you found one start in thousands of starts, you would have to reject the whole batch. Okay, so clubroot often shows up first in low wet portions of the field, just because it prefers those wet environments for the zoospores to swim to the hosts. And if you have clubroot anywhere on the farm, even if you're employing some of these management tactics, you should be monitoring brassicas anywhere on your farm just to see what's going on. And then even on healthy looking brassica plants, after you've harvested, it's still a good practice to go and dig a few of them up or a bunch of them up and check the roots, because sometimes they don't appear to be unhealthy from above. So we'll get into some management tactics. And the key to this one is keeping it off your farm if you don't have it already. This is a disease that you can't get rid of, basically. So once you have it, it's just managing it managing it to a lower level on your farm. So using clean soil and trays and equipment for seed starting and transplanting, checking, knowing the source you're getting your starts from outside the farm if you do it that way. Visiting other farms. When you're visiting other farms, you should clean your boots before you come back to yours. We talk a lot about biosecurity when it comes to livestock, but we don't talk about it when it comes to vegetables. So unfortunately, we have to start thinking about that on vegetable farms too. and sanitizing shared equipment. So within your farm, you can do things to reduce the spread if you found it in one field and you don't have it other places. So managing irrigation so it doesn't carry soil to a clean field. You would want to work in the clean fields first and do the infected fields last, just so you kind of minimize your cleaning of equipment in between. You need to manage your brassica weeds along with your crop plants, because all the brassica weeds can be hosts as well. And then if you know you have it on your farm, it's great practice to let your visitors know that they can spread it someplace else. So anybody who visits your farm, making sure that they are washing their boots before they head out. Okay, so the next cultural management tactics you can use include using long rotations between brassica crops. Also, liming and calcium have been shown to inhibit the growth, excuse me, of clubroot. I included this graphic over here. You can ignore the green box, but basically, a lot of people talk about liming the fields to inhibit clubroot, but actually it's an interaction between calcium and the pH level. So if you look at this chart, you can see that these are the pH numbers below, and then the thickness of these lines and the coloring demonstrates how available different nutrients or minerals are at those pH levels. So with calcium, you can see that the sweet spot is right around 7. So the recommendation is to increase your pH to above 7. And then also, and do it in a way that also increases the availability of calcium. If you're a conventional farmer, some of the nitrogen fertilizers you use can affect clubroot. And then if you get clubroot and you're just trying to save your crop, you can try hilling up the soil around the base of the stems to see if they'll put out some adventitious roots. So Betsy, do you want to chime in here, or do you want to wait until we've kind of gone through these and then talk about your experience?
I could do either or. I can chime in anytime you want.
Why don't we have a break for Betsy to talk about what works for you?
All right, so I let's see, it's probably about 14 years ago, and on the farm that I'm at, there's several farmers farming it, and one of them developed clubroot. And I knew it was only a matter of time till we all had clubroot. We share interns on projects, and everybody walks around. So I knew that I should be on the lookout for it. So I started inspecting roots and seeing, what's the options here. I did find it. I had started doing that, starting starts right in the ground. That was one of the first places I saw it, and my little transplants all had it. And then I found it in a few of my brassicas, my cabbages mostly. It was really discouraging to see that. But with that, I figured I'd better start learning a little bit more about how to manage this. And if everyone doesn't know, this is an increasing problem in the Pacific Northwest. We all love to have brassicas. They do really great in this climate, and they're a great crop to sell at your farmer's market or your farm stand. So knowing how to deal with it, I think, is imperative if you're going to farm in the Pacific Northwest. We've heard just how much it likes water because those little spores swim. So what have I done? The first thing I did is I found out about this whole pH thing, and that it doesn't do as well when the pH is higher. So one of the things that I do religiously with my brassicas is I make sure I lime the soil before I plant brassicas in there. So much so that I put like a small handful of lime in the hole with every transplant. That's helped a lot because I haven't really seen an incident of that. The other thing I do is try to do good crop rotation. I think Laurel Sign mentioned 5 to 7 years. That's kind of challenging some of the time to be able to get that much time. I try to do it 3 or 4 year, but I probably should be better in mapping out my fields a little bit more and trying to aim for the 5 to 7, because a lot of my understanding of this organism is it's how many spores you have dictates the severity of the disease. And so anything you can do to minimize a buildup of inoculum in the soil is going to help to reduce the incident of the problem. So all of, try to pull out the plants after I'm done harvesting, inspecting the roots, absolutely. Burning if you have it, or throwing it in the trash. Do not try to compost it on your farm because it's inadvertently going to potentially cycle back in, like it or not. Once we all started finding incidents of clubroot at some of the farms here in Kitsap, everybody started to panic a little bit, and we asked everybody to start sanitizing their shoes by stepping in a bleach bucket or spraying bleach on them, not sharing tools, and disinfecting things with bleach. Your seed trays, disinfect them with bleach. And that system has been really helpful to minimize it, but sooner or later, just because you can transmit it on your shoes and on tires of equipment, tractors, that it's really challenging to prevent it altogether. So my advice would be almost assume you have it and follow all the recommended cultural management methods you have. Even if you don't have it yet, just be on the lookout. The other thing that when I order my seeds now, I try to find ones that have some resistance to it. So I know Osborne Seeds catalog does list things that are resistant to clubroot. The one challenge is that it might be resistant, but it also might be a carrier. Talk about carriers a lot these days with coronavirus. So even, you can't just assume you still want to follow all good practices, even if you use a resistant variety.
Yeah, so I want to go back to with the monitoring. Exactly, the reason I wrote some of these in here is exactly what Betsy was talking about. So if you have clubroot anywhere on the farm, monitor all your fields, because you really are trying to avoid the buildup of the resting spores, because the more resting spores you have in the soil, the worse infection you're going to have. And there's some farmers who have lost whole crops or half of crops. It can be when it's not controlled adequately, you can have significant economic losses. And so we say that you should monitor it even in fields where you don't think it is, because it can build up silently. You might have one plant here, one plant there, but if you think of the roots rotting in the ground, and then you till over that, and that spreads millions of spores. So you can have a very light infestation for a couple of years, and then boom, you lost your whole crop one year. So it's really monitoring to not let it build up.
And Laurel, just to point out that they say in some of these articles that the spores can live 5 to 7 years. There are reports of them living 20 years, but 5 to 7, and that's the reason why the 5 to 7 year rotation is the suggested amount of time.
Yeah, exactly. And as Betsy said, you use shorter rotations, and I've heard that from other farmers who are dealing with it. They use 4-year rotations, but in the literature that I looked at between OSU, WSU, and Cornell, the recommended ideal rotations is 5 to 7 years. And I think the half-life of the spores is like 3.5 years or something like that. And so if you think of like half the spores are gone after 3.5 years, and then half of the remaining half is another 3.5 years. So yeah, there is evidence of it staying in the soil up to 20. Okay, so here's, Betsy mentioned using resistant varieties, and these are some examples, but I put some stars next to them because there's multiple different races of clubroot, and depending on what you have, some of these are going to be resistant to a single race, and others multiple races. And so in order to really get the benefits of resistant varieties, you have to kind of play around with it or get the race tested to see what's going to work for you. And if you have high enough spore load in your soil, it could just overwhelm the resistance anyway. So and then I think Betsy pointed out that even resistant varieties, it doesn't mean they're immune to it. They can still be carriers of the disease, and they can still perpetuate the disease. So even though this is one of the most inexpensive ways to just switching varieties to deal with this, you still have to be careful with it. So in integrated pest management, if conditions call for it, as a last resort, we say, okay, go for the chemical options. So I just wanted to list those, and that slide looks pretty empty. So basically, if you're a conventional farmer, you do have some options for pre-plant fumigants and transplant drenches. But for organic farming, those haven't existed so far. I did come across information about a biofungicide that on the Pacific Northwest Disease Management Handbook, they list this product called Pre-Stop. It's been relabeled to call Lalstop now. And it's this, it's a biofungicide, which means that you use it as a soil drench. So this is a soil drench that's available to organic farmers. And what happens is this good fungus colonizes the roots, and so the more it colonizes the roots, the less able the clubroot and some other bad root funguses can get in. What I read about this is it's very effective in greenhouse settings, a little bit less in the field, and you have to reapply it. The key is to drench the soil with it. So this is an option that's out there. Betsy, I don't know if you've run into it.
I have not. I'm just looking it up right now. They
Okay.
say superior to root shield, plant shield, actinovate, serenade against many diseases, but I haven't. This is the first I've heard of it. Was tonight.
Yeah, it was the first I've heard of it too. So this is out there as an option. And hopefully, if there's anybody in the audience who has any experience with this, we'd love to hear from you too. So that was just kind of an overview of the disease and the kind of best management practices. And so we had a bunch of questions that came in before the presentation. So I wanted to address a few of them. Some of them should have been answered during the presentation, and then we'll open it up for if Betsy has more information or if folks want to join the conversation. So somebody asked if rhubarb was something that could inhibit clubroot development. And this is kind of, it was a method that was mentioned, kind of it's an old treatment, but in research, it actually didn't hold up. The idea was to put a piece of rhubarb stem into the planting hole with a brassica plant, or to make tea out of rhubarb and pour that, water the plants with it. And research showed that there wasn't any difference in the clubroot infection. But I thought it was interesting, two things about rhubarb. The first was that it's high in calcium, and so theoretically that that could be a piece. The calcium could help, but in the research it didn't. Also, rhubarb is related to curly dock, and it's in the Polygonaceae family. And some of those plants actually can be infected with clubroot. I've never seen rhubarb listed, but that's just an interesting comment. So unfortunately, no, there's no research for that one. The second one, somebody asked about rotating onions, and whether that would do more than just being something different than a brassica. And I did run across some research on Welsh onions and potato onions. And the research in potato onions did show that there was kind of back in the life cycle, I circled the point where they go from the resting spore to the zoospore, and the research that tried the potato onions, that's the one I read about. The Welsh onions, I assume, would be the same. The root exudates actually inhibited the zoospores from doing their thing to some extent, but it worked better if you actually distilled the root exudates instead of just putting onions in the rotation. But according to the research I read, it could be a possible helpful thing to do, including onions in your rotation. Somebody asked if wood ash would inhibit the clubroot, and wood ash is a way to increase the pH of your soil, and also it has a lot of calcium in it. So yes, increasing pH and adding calcium are two key components of a integrated pest management plan. I would just say that with lime, you can actually get soil tests done and know the amount to apply to reach your desired, 7 pH or above. With wood ash, it's a little bit, it's going to be not as scientific, I guess, but it does have the components that are needed. So as long as you're testing the pH and getting soil tests to confirm that you're raising your pH to the needed level, then I think wood ash could be fine.
Laurel,
Yes.
there's a question from Abby about whether it harms any herbs or flowers. Can you touch on that at all?
The answer is no. They're not the other hosts, plants that can be host to clubroot. None of them that I know of show the same damage as brassicas do. They carry it, but they don't get the thickened roots or destroy the plant. There are in those plant families that I mentioned, there's if a lot of people use curly dock as an edible wild one, and that can be a carrier of clubroot even without symptoms. There's certain clovers that can, strawberries can, these are, but it won't hurt them. Okay, so the second question that I wanted to touch on here from the pre-class questions was, well, what do you mean by sanitizing equipment? And that's a really good question. And I hope Betsy will chime in on this, because this is a recommendation that you mechanically, scrape the soil off of your boots or your tractor or your other equipment, and then you use a hose or a pressure washer to get the rest off, and then you spray it down with a 2% bleach solution, and let that sit for a while. I know in practice it's harder than that. So Betsy, what do you say?
I think this is how it has spread to different farms. And if farmers have more than one farm and they're moving their equipment around, and it's not always convenient to get it pressure washed because you're up against time getting work done. And, I'd bet money that this is how it spreads. It's just that we're so busy trying to do our farm activities that we're not always vigilant about this sanitation practice, because we don't think we're going to get it right, and then sooner or later we inadvertently spread it. I know with things like rototillers, if you ever look underneath a rototiller, there's masses of dirt caught up underneath there, and that's probably one of the easiest ways to spread it. Even if you're dipping your shoes on your tractor, there's dirt caught in the wheel on the tires, but I think it's the rototillers got like more than anything else. And just having the time and easy access to a pressure washer to clean everything off every time is part of the problem. But if you are using equipment from somebody else, and you haven't had Clubroot yet, you might want to sanitize before you borrow something, to try to minimize it, just, because it's around.
Yeah. It's that's about what I was expecting to hear. It's really hard sometimes to fit in these things that would help, and sometimes even your best efforts aren't good enough. So the more of these different tactics you can employ, the better off you're going to be. So there were some other questions that came in before the class, but I think we have addressed a lot of them. But folks are welcome to put questions in the chat box, or if there's people out there who have experience with Clubroot and you want to comment on any of this, please do.
Yeah, this is a great chance to share, everyone. So just jump in.
I see that Diane's on now and she has a question. Diane, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question for Laurel and Betsy? Maybe she's
How
not.
about Parasan? Is it as effective as bleach?
Say that again.
About Parasan, peracetic acid. Is it as effective as bleach for sanitizing equipment and tools?
I'm writing that down because I don't know. And so that's something I'll have to look up.
And I'm sorry I was late, but did we talk about any pre-treats? I mean, obviously there's, if you're not organic, there's diazinon to dip your transplants in. Are there any OMRI approved dips that you can use for transplants?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's one she mentioned earlier.
Yeah, we'll go back to.
I can watch the recording. It's okay, but
okay. There's one biofungicide that's listed, but I would encourage you to read up on it, and it seems really promising. So, but there's definitely some drawbacks because you have to keep the quantity in the soil up. And so on the disinfection, I was just gonna say there's always drawbacks to the different disinfecting methods. Parasan, I'm gonna look that up because it's not something I'm familiar with, but I know that bleach, sometimes people struggle with that because it can be kind of corrosive. It will cause metal to rust. There's certain types of plastic it can weaken over time. So when I've used bleach as a sanitizing agent previously, I'll let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes on there and then rinse it off. In many cases, rubbing alcohol is quite effective, or more effective than bleach, at least in a short amount of time, but it's so much more expensive and it's just not practical to hose your tractor off with rubbing alcohol. But I'll look up the Parasan. I'm interested in that. So.
Is that it's a type of peracetic acid? Is that what you're saying? Because it's not listed as a name brand that
it's a peracetic acid. We used to use it in the dairy, and I mean, my concern, of course, with chlorine-based disinfectants is that I'm not a fan of them for many of the reasons that were listed. Plus, when you start looking at the levels that are really effective at disinfecting, just splashing a bit in the bucket is not, and using it to slosh your tractor is probably not going to, you're not going to have sufficient chlorine ion activity. So you really should be using a dip strip. I mean, there's just like all the things, right?
Yeah. The recommendation is a 2% bleach solution, but you're absolutely right. I didn't hit on that. With bleach, it actually degrades pretty quickly. And so once you mix up a solution, it's only good for like half an hour or something like that. I would have to look up the exact one. And then as it gets more, if you're using it as a dip, as it gets more soil in it, it also becomes less effective. So so there's multiple things you have to think about with using bleach.
Yeah, and with anything, I'm just looking up periacetic acid, and it will react with organic materials. Periacetic acid may attack plant materials such as rubber gaskets. So we have some of those on like rototillers, and at higher concentrations, corrosion might be a problem. So it's just, you know, something to look up if you, whatever sanitizer you want to use. I mean, the biggest issue is if you have actual soil material on there, the chance that you, and if you used a rototiller, you know, sometimes all the roots wrap around the shaft and that kind of stuff. If you're going through a field that has some clubroot and that's still on there, the chance that you could spread it is higher. So, you know, it's like with anything, how do we manage it? How do we keep inoculum levels low? And so sanitation of, and just getting, even if you only have a hose with a little high pressure hand nozzle on there, it's going to be better than not doing anything at all. And then monitoring your fields, good rotation practices. And the thing that I found was really useful, especially if you're on a smaller scale and you can actually have the time to add a little extra lime in that planting hole, you can try to reduce the incident in your farm.
Yeah, that's another thing I actually wanted to go back to, because I'm sure there's a lot of folks in the audience that are kind of going towards the low and no till. And one of the most important things when you're liming, as opposed to just liming for crop production, if you're liming for disease management, you actually have to really incorporate the lime really evenly. So, you know, whereas you might usually just use pelleted lime and, you know, it does what it does. For this type of liming, they recommend using powdered lime or prilled lime, and then really working it in very well so it's evenly distributed. Because if you have pockets where you don't reach that minimum of a 7 pH, you can still have clubroot spores doing their thing in that soil. So you may not get control throughout your field.
So how do they respond? How does spores respond to heat?
They like wet conditions, but not necessarily cold conditions. So they're active. The temperatures where they're active mostly, they can be active in colder soils, is I think about, I can't remember if it's 54 or 57 to 81 degrees. As the soil warms up, there's the activity actually increases. So
I'm talking about the kill temperature. Are they an encapsulated spore like, say, botulism? Or are they, I mean, if say you had a pressure washer that had a heat function and you could steam?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to add that to my list.
I have a question. So I've heard that overwintering brassicas can exacerbate the problem. Is that so?
Betsy, you want to get that, or you want me to?
I haven't seen that in my farm per se, but again, I don't have a lot of acreage in Brassica at any one time. So I can't say one way or the other. Go ahead, Laurel.
Yeah, according to the having brassicas in one spot for more than one crop rotation at a time is generally bad when you're dealing with clubroot. When you leave the plants in the soil over the winter, the spores are released when the roots are rotting, and so that was a question that was asked before the class, and I meant to hit on that. There's certain plants that just won't show above ground symptoms, even though they're infected below the ground. So if you overwintered those, even though the plant's still alive, the roots are kind of slewing off dead material constantly. And so you are, if you have clubroot, if that plant that you're overwintering has clubroot, it's going to perpetuate the problem. So not a good idea. If you have clubroot on your farm, and as Betsy mentioned, if you have really low levels, maybe you can get away with it.
So that also means that when you're removing what brassica, I mean, because one of the, like the no-till mantras is you leave as much in the soil as possible. And so a lot of times you just clip the roots right at ground level. And so if you're concerned about it, where brassicas are concerned, you probably should be removing all the roots too. Correct?
Yeah, that's if you can get the roots out of the ground before they start rotting, you potentially can prevent millions of spores from getting into the soil. So yeah, unfortunately, this is not a good disease for no-till folks to get, just because that, incorporating lime is a huge tool, and then also checking out the roots. It's not always practical to remove plant material from your fields, depending on the size of your farm. And but as much as you can, getting infected tissue out of there is going to help lower the spore load.
One of the challenges I see is how you have these weeds that are also potential carriers, and that's just something to be super aware of. I'm looking at the list right now, different arugula, canola, money plants, all the mustards, shepherd's purse, a wild radish, yellow rocket, all that, are some of the ones that are carriers for this. And so, just sort of being aware of what's your weed population is going to potentially affect your overall inoculum level, and being able to let those areas rest between your brassica crops.
Yeah, there was actually one of the publications that I'll recommend for folks to look at is this EM 9148, and they have a couple case studies in there, and one of them is a farmer who said, well, I did all these rotations, but I forgot that in my mixed greens there were brassicas. So you really have to pay attention to all your crops, whether you might be thinking broccoli and cabbage, but brassicas are so common. That's the Pacific Northwest is the best place in the world to grow them. And then also, yeah, your weeds too. So.
Yeah, this is a great time. If anybody else wants to hop on and share your experience with managing Clubroot, monitoring, anything that you want to share. Looks like Spencer has put some stuff in. Spencer, do you want to? I don't know if Spencer has capability for. Let's see.
No, I just found the information on the PNW handbooks .org for the composting and temperature control, and then my personal experience utilizing mineral oil to help decrease the retention of soil on your tools.
Okay. Great idea.
And there's a question. Can you go back a slide with the resource list?
Yep.
I did put the EM 9148 PDF link in the chat, and we're going to also send out the slide deck with the resource links to all attendees after. So don't feel like you have to take down that information now if you don't want to, but if you do want to check it out now and get it up on your computer, it's the links in the chat box.
So Jess, this is like a practical thing, but I know that we have interns that are visiting one farm and another. Is there a way for us to be, in the interest of full disclosure, sharing what you have on your farm, so that people know that if they're coming back to a farm that's not,
yeah,
I mean, we really want to focus on education, but we don't necessarily want to be typhoid Marys either.
Yeah. So what Diane's referring to for other folks is we run a it's called Kitsap Farm Mentor Program here in Kitsap, and Betsy is actually a farm mentor of ours. And so the program has farm mentors that work together and bring their interns together for multiple classes a month during the season on different farms. And so, yeah, so if we do disclose, Betsy will tell you 100%, like we've had these conversations for Clubroot before with everybody, but we also on our reminders to interns for group classes, make sure to put a biosecurity disclaimer on there and make sure everybody knows if you're coming onto somebody else's farm, please make sure to wear non-farm boots onto the farm or be prepared to put your boots into a dip solution. So we definitely do that. We need to probably be more vigilant with that. As Betsy already pointed out previously, you know, you get in a hurry and people, I'm sure there's been interns that have come on farms who have not heeded that advice. So yeah, I don't know, Betsy, do you want to say anything else about the intern piece of that movement?
Well, that, I mean, it is something that we try to talk about because it's important. I mean, this whole biosecurity thing and is super important. And I think it ties in with the world we've just been living in for the last almost 2 years now. So microbes rule, so be wary.
Yeah, I've been impressed, you know, when I visited farms in Kitsap that have Clubroot, they, you know, the farmers are always, you know, say, hey, I've got Clubroot on my farm. I just wanted to let you know, make sure you're cleaning your boots afterwards. So that's, I really appreciate that upfront information.
Yeah, and to that point too, I think there's you know, Laurel and I have had this discussion, and I think Betsy was part of it too. You know, we're going to plan to continue these discussions on integrated pest management, and we have, you know, identified that the biosecurity piece needs to be brought up in every single session, regardless. So, someone else was hopping on. Sorry, was it Spencer?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Nope.
Pressurized hand sprayer with your chlorine solution. Remember that if it's in a contained space, the bleach chlorine will stay in solution much longer. So if you keep it in a, you know, a hand, you know, a pump hand sprayer, it'll last a lot longer.
Yeah, and an added bonus is those sprayers are already made of plastic that's made to resist chemicals, so they won't break down as easily as some other plastics.
We've got plenty of time. If anybody else has anything else they would like to share. I don't know if Betsy, if you had anything else that you came to mind as we were talking through this.
No, just that, you know, I mean, I feel like with the systems I've been using, I haven't seen it in my fields, and probably I haven't seen it. I looked for it in over 8 years. So, but I know it's on the farm because I've seen it in other places, but I'm just aware of it. And I do, if somebody said I have to get it dispersed, you know, and again, on my scale, not really giant with brassicas, but I add a small amount in. I have that little claw cultivator and I make sure I incorporate it within a kind of it's like several cup area to disperse that lime in that area as I'm putting the transplant in. I don't just rely on my like broadcast lime applications. I add more to the transplant hole because I really want to raise that pH up in that area. And that has worked. Again, it's probably a little more labor intensive than would work on some other farms who are doing a large amount of brassicas, but with my scale, that has been effective and I have been able to keep it. I haven't seen it, but just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not there. It just hasn't manifested in a visible form but it's round.
Do you have, sorry, go ahead, Laurel.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I love hearing that, and I've heard that from Dana too in Kitsap County. I love hearing that people have it under control and you can still farm economically without, it's manageable. So that's a good message.
Yeah, and I think part of it is you still have to know the life cycle. You have to understand these principles and you have to incorporate them into your crop planning. And you can't just say, well, I want to do all these brassicas. You got to say, well, maybe I can't. Maybe I have to change what I'm planting because I have to also manage this disease as part of my overall farm plan. And so there are other options out there. Maybe we don't like them as much because we all love all those brassicas. They're so wonderful, and things like kale. You can make so much money per square foot on all those bunches of kale. And maybe we can't do that. Maybe we have to actually incorporate other crops or resting periods with non-host species of clubroot.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Dana as well, just because we had a recent roundtable with our mentors and interns, and she had mentioned clubroot. And so I was curious, Betsy, if you know how she has she been doing the same thing with filling additional lime in as you're planting, or is she using
I've talked to her about it, so she knows about it. I would assume we share a lot of information, and she does do crop rotation. And so it sort of showed up on some other farms within the last few years, and we're not sure exactly how it got to those other farms. Was spread by soil? It could have been some transplants that some of those folks got that then started it. But one of the questions I have for you, Laurel, is do you know, and maybe it's in some of these references, but I can't recall them, if different soil types are more conducive to clubroot spread than others? In other words, if you have a much sandier soil versus a heavier clay soil would be, I know how you can affect pH, it can vary depending on soil type. So because of the buffering capacity of the soil. So could you speak to soil types, buffering, and being able to raise the pH to a higher level depending on that, and so the incident of clubroot, potential incident of clubroot?
Yeah. So I'll just say I'm not a soil scientist, but I'll say as much as I know. I haven't seen anything in the literature about soil type affecting clubroot per se. It's more about what you alluded to is the ability for that soil's pH to be adjusted. There's certain soils that just resist pH changes much better than others. And so when you are doing that initial adjustment of your pH up to 7, you should work with a soil lab, get your soil tested, and they will be able to see other aspects of your soil and give you the amount that you need to apply to reach your desired pH. And then of course you need to test the pH afterwards to make sure it got up that far. I think Dana mentioned that it was over 8 or 11 years. She said she finally got up to above 7. So for some, it could be a more gradual process, but really, according to research, the benefits of increasing the pH of your soil for clubroot don't appear until most people say above 7, some people say above 6.8. So let's just say 7 or above. So yeah, different soil types are going to affect the possibility of adjusting the pH. And I know this is kind of related a little when we talk about blueberries, because blueberries are the opposite. You want the soil to be more acidic. And for blueberries, we say, okay, if your soil pH is above, I think 6.5, it's not worth trying to adjust the pH lower because it's going to take too much, sulfur to do that. And so I haven't heard the same for adjusting it up for clubroot. Maybe that's because blueberries are a perennial crop and you can make a different choice of where to put them. And vegetables, you gotta grow them. So yeah, your soil type is gonna affect the how easy it is to adjust the pH. So I don't know if that answered your whole question, but that's as much as I know. It's about the pH and the calcium more so than the soil type.
So Laurel does a really great question, just came up in the chat, and it said, where was it? I just lost it. It had to do with how long the spores survive outside the soil, that is in a vegetable bin or on the edge of a packed up greenhouse. So in other words, like stuff if got thrown there, like the old roots, and how long can they, or you had your picking bin, you were hauling your old plants out or something, how long can these spores survive?
I think so. Any means of spreading soil is how the spores are going to spread. So back to the soil type, even blowing dust, that can spread spores as well. So just putting that in there. But for the spore longevity, I would say the same. Typical 5 to 7 years, but up to 20 years would apply to that as well, because they're, the spores are going to be in the soil. The spores, the resting spores, are actually have a hardened structure that protects them from the elements to some extent. So I would say that they'll live in those spaces just as long as they would in your soil.
There's another question too. Well, there's two other questions that I'm seeing. The first is that someone might have missed it, but how is it being transmitted to transplants? And I know that you touched on that, I think or a little bit on that already.
Yeah. One thing I've seen talked about multiple times is when you're growing transplants in potting media. Most people, farmers, get some type of soilless mix to use, and that wouldn't be contaminated. But oftentimes you might set those flats on the ground outside to harden off or something like that, and just having the roots in contact with soil that's infected can spread the infection to those starts. Also any soil in the greenhouse that's, because it's hard to keep mud and just regular soil out of things. So it just depends on how clean you keep your potting space.
But Laurel, depending on, like, some people make their own kind of compost, whatever, to make their own potting soil out. Because I do know a farmer who, I don't think they put their flats on the ground, but all their little transplants, they had clubroot in them. So
did they?
So I don't know whether it came from the mix. They didn't buy a bagged mix per se. They bought a like a tote thing, and I'm not sure of what the practices were at that facility. But so, and it sort of, you never know. I mean, if you don't know, if you're buying material to use for your starts, you should know who you're getting it from, because what if somebody bought a bunch of brassicas that were contaminated and got chopped up into a composting facility, and it didn't get heated up enough to kill the spores, and then ultimately mixed in with other stuff, and it made into some kind of a commercial mix that is then sold in a tote, and then you start all your starts from that. So they were never able to track down exactly where that came from, but it was really disturbing.
That's a really good point, and that's something I've been wondering about myself. I haven't seen any discussion of, obviously hot composting can kill a lot of pathogens and a lot of seeds, but even when you have a hot composting system, it's not, the outside of the pile or the edges of the pile may not get to that hot temperature. But I, as I mentioned before, I don't know what the heat, what amount of heat will kill it. And anytime you have it in compost, you're kind of, playing with fire a little bit, even if you have a hot composting system. One thing I could recommend is you can get soil sterilizers. It's just one more step, but you can the ones that I've used in the past, you can, I'm trying to think what volume of soil we could, it was probably 3 cubic feet or something, 3 or 4 cubic feet. Well, it's probably closer to 4 cubic feet of soil that we could sterilize at once with a steam sterilizer. So that's something that folks could invest in if you're, if you're incorporating compost from an unknown source.
Laurel,
Yep.
this is Spencer. I did post in the chat earlier, again, in the PNW handbooks
Mhm.
source, it does indicate 50 degrees C or 120 F for 7 days or 24 hours at 60 C.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks.
So now looping back around to the discussion about like changing your pH. I know that one of the dynamics around changing your pH and your nutrient management, I mean, brassicas are heavy feeders. So you're like looking at your nutrient levels, but your nitrogen will actually mess with your pH as well. And so how do you deal with that? And like, if you're pushing your pH to 7.5, what impact does that have on like your micronutrient absorption and those kinds of things?
That's a good question. I don't think just going to 7 or a little bit above 7, I don't think that affects the micronutrient and nutrient absorption enough to really to matter. I'm not 100% sure about that, because you can see here in the chart that I'm showing with iron and manganese and boron and copper, those are more readily taken up in more acidic environments. But I haven't seen that mentioned in the literature, which could mean it's not a big problem that people have encountered, or it's just not something they've talked about yet. So that's my thought on that. With fertilizer, I understand that the organic sources of nitrogen fertilizer are less likely to affect the pH in the soil. The bigger concern is with the conventional nitrogen fertilizers like ammonium, which can reduce the pH for sure, because that's definitely what's recommended for blueberries. And for conventional farmers, they mentioned using nitrogen. It was a nitrogen with calcium in it. So as far as what I understand, the organic sources of nitrogen fertilizer are less likely to affect the pH in the soil. Does that kind of help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So there's another question, Laurel, in the chat. Maybe you can go back to the slide that has this information on it. The question, so carrier plants and compost will be an issue too. Do you have a solid list of carrier plants? I know you had a list, but can you go back to that? I can't remember if you put on there where you got it from.
Okay, sorry. Where did that go? Oh, here we go. Okay. This is not a complete list. This list I actually swiped from the Cornell information on Clubroot, but then there was a better list, although it didn't include weeds, in this EM 9148. They had a more thorough list of crops. Not necessarily, they didn't categorize them in their level of susceptibility, but I would just assume any wild mustard, any weed you have in the mustard family, whether it's shepherd's purse or shotweed, or I would assume all of those are potential carriers. Strangely, I haven't seen shotweed mentioned specifically in the literature, so but any mustard weeds you've got, I would assume those are carriers.
Awesome. And I did put that on the chat so everybody can see it again too, just in case they missed it up higher. And then the other question is, if you are a no-till farmer, can you compost the above ground components of potentially infected plants relatively safely?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and maybe Betsy or other farmers will chime in with this. The pathogen is found in the roots exclusively, and so you should be able to just cut off the top growth and compost that. But I guess depending on how you're going about it, if you're, hacking off all your, the remainder of your cauliflower plants or whatever, they're going to get soil on them, as you're piling them up. Or so just think about that, is can you transport that top growth without getting a bunch of soil on it? And if you're using no-till and you've got a bunch of mulch down, that's going to add an extra barrier. So yeah, so the answer is the pathogen is in the roots, but but still it can be passed if you get, mud splashed onto the top of the plant too.
Is Clubroot UV sensitive? Ultraviolet sunlight?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, the question would be those resting spores. That's the real source of the problem.
Yeah.
And a lot of resting spores on different pathogens are meant to withstand several years. And so if they do have this casing on the outside, then I would put money that they're pretty resistant.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
The other question I think that got missed earlier is our current map of where Clubroot is in the state, anything in Whatcom County? So I don't know of like a tracking map. Do you know, Laurel?
I don't. I was kind of interested in developing a tracking map, and I don't want to do it I don't know if farmers would feel shamed or whatever. I don't want to do it for that reason, but I am very curious about where it is, because I know it's almost it's kind of off the radar in Clallam County. I've seen it, as I mentioned before, at the local community garden, and it pops up very, very occasionally, but there aren't any farmers that I know that have it. Whereas in Kitsap, it's been a problem for a while, and I know it's become a huge problem in the Willamette Valley, just because I have feelers out there too. But I don't know where all it is. So
I know it's up in Jefferson County too, because I heard about that. So it's sort of spreading everywhere. And if that one publication that's on the list kind of talks about it, and it's partly tied in with how so many farmers are really developing their Brassica program, because it's such a good crop in this climate and it all sells well and it's a good moneymaker. So it's just something that it's allowing it to spread. I don't know how initially it jumps around, but certainly out there.
Yeah, it sounds like so Megan just put in the chat, it's in San Juan County. So that sounds like an interesting project, Laurel.
Yeah.
It's all over the country. I've been just looking on the web, in England they have it, it's around, and I don't, the interesting thing is that, how could it spread so many places? Is what's the mechanism that it spreads? Not that really helps us. I don't think it's one that is seed carried, so that wouldn't be it. But
yeah, I was thinking about that being seed carried, and I don't think it is, but in some of the seed cleaning processes, you do get some soil in there. And so potentially, I don't know how likely it is. It seems very unlikely, but a spore could get in there. Yeah, and just, I've noticed, when you're selling onions, if they're coming from a field that is infected with clubroot, it's hard to get all that soil off of the roots. So, that's another way it could be getting around, is on vegetables that aren't carriers but still might have soil on them. but yeah, any way that soil travels, the clubroot can travel. I know there's a study in Canada that showed that it could travel in dust from farm to farm, but they found it in dust, but they hadn't conclusively identified any cases where it actually spread because of the dust. So yeah.
Yeah, and in Canada, they actually have a map of Clubroot, like where it's at and what.
Oh, yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
Oh, and it looks like Diane put that's also in Lewis County.
Yeah, I know it's spread pretty extensively. I haven't seen a map yet. So
And then I think Lizzie put in just recently, can you compost clean greens of brassicas that have clubroot? And I think you kind of already touched on that a bit.
yeah, I'd say yes.
Yes.
I know Dana talked about having her quarantine compost pile where she puts everything that's infected with clubroot or anything that has seeds on it, and she just dumps it and never touches it, and it's just in a very out of the way corner. So yeah. And then Betsy, I think you mentioned burning.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that would also, it would be kind of a cathartic thing to do, light it all on fire.
Yeah, so I'm just like reading again, sort of to be aware of these other things that are hosts for it, which includes orchard grass.
Yep.
So velvet grass,
Mm-hmm.
and then some ryegrass species,
Mm-hmm.
wild strawberry, poppy, we mentioned, red clover,
Yep.
and sorrel. And so it's just like, that's the concern, is that there's all these things that we all have growing around, and it's just so the management becomes a little more complicated. But I guess my word of advice would be always add some extra lime to your brassicas and try to do your best to figure out a cropping plan that allows you to rotate and monitor, look for it happening. I think the lime, adding extra lime to the transplants, using transplants versus direct seeding, and then adding that extra lime is a way. Clean potting soil that you use for starting your stuff, sanitizing all your flats, so you're not putting them in a clubroot area and then bringing them to your greenhouse, because a lot of times we use those 72 cells, but then we put them inside a heavier thing and then we put them on the ground. So that kind of stuff, that having a sanitation system to try to minimize this, because it's kind of inoculum. The more it takes a certain amount of inoculum to get to, just like with the coronavirus, you have to have breathe in so many spores, right? It's the same thing with this. You have to have a certain amount of inoculum before it really starts causing economic damage. And the idea is that we try to reduce the overall inoculum through these various practices.
Yeah. Another recommendation I was reading about that it would be more or less effective depending on the size of your farm was if you had a field that had a really high spore load. They said, well, plant it into a perennial grass for 4 or 5 years. But then I thought about that. I was like, well, how do you make sure that you don't, I guess you really have to make sure you aren't getting any of those carrier species in there as well. But if you have enough land to do that, just get it out of production and into perennial grass for a while that is not a species that's known to be a carrier, then you can do that as well, just to let the spores just sit there and die, because they do have that half-life.
Yeah, but then you have a perennial grass weed problem the next time you want to put it in cultivation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they also say planting corn. North Carolina is saying planting corn or alfalfa can reduce the amount of inoculum. Then they also mention, because weedy hosts that they list can allow the pathogen to reproduce, weed management is critical. So it's just, so this has been around in a lot of places besides ours. So there's definitely information out there to help. But I guess we wanted to have this talk because farmers are seeing it, and even if you don't have it yet, just to be proactive on your farm to either prevent it from coming to your farm through biosecurity, and if you do get it, then you want to be able to manage it effectively from the beginning. And so knowledge to me is power, and just being aware of this shouldn't, it might sound discouraging, but the reality is in the long run, this is going to help for more successful farming of brassicas, because we can catch it earlier and or prevent it, and we can control it if we're on it, if we're paying attention. And I think Laura, somebody mentioned that the EM 9148, they do have some case studies down in Oregon that where people lost huge acreage to it. So it's that's what happens if you aren't paying attention.
Yeah, the scale of farming down in the Willamette Valley is a little bit different than most of the farms around here in our Tri-County area, but that's what I was gonna say is when we were planning this talk, I kept thinking, how do we get people that don't already have Clubroot to come to this? Because people who have it and know about it, they're like, oh my God, this is important. But people who's not even on their radar, those are the folks that we need to reach, because prevention is the best, the best thing you can do. So I hope everybody who attended today will talk about it a lot, and, with their other farming neighbors.
Looks like we have one more in the Kaylee. Looks like you have a question that you want to touch on a point about micronutrient availability, increasing pH. I don't know if you want to unmute. I think this was getting to what Diane also had. I think it was Diane that had also brought that up, maybe. Some micronutrients like manganese are absorbed to the soil particles and not plant available when the pH is around 7. I just want to make sure if that's the question. I think you're pointing that out. Diane, is that
Well,
what
actually, a pH of 7 isn't high enough to do significant damage to nutrient uptake for anything except like phosphorus and iron. But it does beg the question, is that if you're being a little overzealous with the lime, you can end up with banding in your feet. Like if I were doing it, what I would probably do is I would just probably lime an entire row and then run over it with the mantis, and rather than putting it in, because I'm lazy, and I could end up with banding if I wasn't careful.
That's true. I was going to say back to the pH thing. So doing regular pH testing is great to make sure you're not going too far. But with this use of the second using hydrated lime right before you plant, this is only recommended if your soil level is below 7.5. So hopefully nobody's getting up to 7.5, but all the places where the second application of lime is recommended, they specifically talk about don't do it if your pH is above 7.5.
Yeah, and we'll go ahead and, like Laurel said earlier, we'll include this slide deck as a follow-up email. So everybody has that. And I think you also cited where you got that from on there. You did. So yeah. So I know we're getting fairly close to time here. We have a few more minutes. Does anybody have any additions they want to put in there, or anything else you want to share, an experience you've had with Clubroot? Want to make sure to allow everybody a chance. And if you
One-
don't, oh, go
I
ahead.
was going to say one other thing is, as I mentioned the resistant varieties that I listed, those weren't necessarily ones from the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to make a bigger effort to find that list that was created in Western Oregon, because I think those would be the ones that are most likely to be successful here as well. So when Jess sends out resources, hopefully we'll be able to include that.
Yeah, that would be great. I do know that we actually, and I was telling Betsy before we came on, we actually had 25 participants who registered, all of which probably didn't join us tonight, but that came from other areas outside of our region. So I think the list that you have in there is great. And then, yeah, we can include one that's more localized for us as well. Do either of you guys have anything else to say before we close out?
I want to encourage people to keep participating in these talks. And, you know, I find it's really fascinating to me as a farmer. I have found having knowledge about life cycles of pest problems has been really helpful. It's also it's interesting. I'm a science person anyhow, so it just helps me appreciate the complexity all around us, and that being a farmer does involve a lot of skill sets, and having this program, I think, really helps to raise our knowledge level as farmers. And then I also really encourage everybody to share information, because as we do this, we're learning about new things. And sometimes people are trying stuff that the scientists haven't tried yet, and we found it worked, and that kind of leads towards potentially more research that then could help organic farmers. And so I thank everybody for coming and participating, and hope we continue to do this in the future.
Yeah, no, I want to thank, obviously, both of you, Laurel, who, for those of you who are on the call who don't know Laurel, she has been recently added to our regional small farms team, and Qualam, Jefferson, and Kitsap as our IPM specialist, and she's available to any farmer in those 3 counties. If you're having issues or questions, please visit our website. We have a new farmer technical assistance form that you can actually fill out directly on that site for any technical assistance you need. But there is a pest specific section that you can fill out, and Laurel, it gets forwarded directly to her. And so she'll respond to you. So she's an amazing resource. And also Betsy, thank you so much, because you've been an amazing resource for us as well with these dirt talks and farming in general in our county and the 3 county areas actually. So I think, Betsy, what you said is leads really well into this is a series that's not specific to IPM, but we kind of focused on that this year because we got Laurel on our team and we were wanting to highlight and really start these discussions. I did just put the evaluation for this session in the chat, and I'll also put it in the email for follow-up. But we encourage you to please take that evaluation and let us know what your thoughts were about it, because we're going to use your information to inform what we're going to do in 2022. So if you like these series of talks, please give your input, because we want to keep doing them. Laurel, did you have anything else to say before we close it out?
No, I think in that survey, you probably have a question about what are other topics you'd like us to cover. Is that okay? Yeah, do that, because we do schedule these topics based on your requests, and it's really important for us to cover topics that are meaningful to you. You know, so and also I want to reiterate that I love learning from all the different farms that I visit, because there's some of these things that I don't know as much about, and so I rely on the WSU and just the research out there, which oftentimes isn't as applicable to organic farms, and so it means a lot to me and to my growth and how I can help other farmers to learn from you guys and what works for you.
Yes, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. I will definitely send out a follow-up email to everybody. And then this recording will also be housed on our new online learning section of our Regional Small Farms website page. So be looking for that soon. Have a good night.
Thanks, guys.